I have been instructed, no permitted, to record this only under the condition that it never escapes the walls of the archive vault. They told me the act of confession might slow the cognitive drift, though none of them said it with any particular conviction. They simply repeated the phrase as if repeating it made it true. Verbalization stabilizes identity. Verbalization stabilizes identity. Even now, as I speak, I'm not sure whether I am verbalizing for them or for something else. Before these events, I believed I understood who I was. I believed identity to be a fixed point, something you could mark on a data slate, something that could be confirmed by retinal scans and oath logs. I believed in the Imperial creed not out of fear, but out of habit, structure, and the strange comfort that comes from being part of an order so much larger, so impossibly vast, that your own insignificance becomes a kind of sanctuary. That was before the idea took root, before I understood what it means to be trapped in a system that is not a system at all, but a gradual reconfiguration of truth. They want me to recount the earliest signs, the moments when doubt entered my mind. But doubt wasn't the beginning. The beginning was clarity, a clarity so sharp it cut through every assumption I had ever carried. And that clarity came from discovering documents I was never meant to see. I was an archivist then, lower tier, stationed in the subhabs where old census records and forgotten manufacturer rosters gathered dust like dead skin. My job was to sift, to sort, to cleanse the data flow of irrelevant material before transmitting it upward. A role beneath notice, a role safe in anonymity, or so I believed. The file that changed everything had no title, no seal, no code. A blank square in a sea of meticulously labeled entries. I accessed it expecting corruption, some leftover packet from a failed cogitator backup. Instead, I found a voice, not audio, but written in a style too intimate to qualify as bureaucratic. A confession by another archivist, one who described thoughts I recognized as my own long before I should have been able to recognize them. He wrote of a presence not external, not alien in form, but alien in concept, something woven into the habits of the hive itself. He wrote of a pattern of joining, a way of thinking shared silently across workers, citizens, entire strata of the hive, invisible to official surveillance because it did not break rules. It merely rendered them irrelevant. He described an order that is not an order, a community that did not recruit but awakened. I read his words and found them strangely soothing, as though they articulated something I had sensed but never admitted. And yet, beneath that calm resonance, there was another feeling, a chill along the back of my skull that warned me I was being altered as I read. For days afterward, I tried to dismiss the file as a hoax, a heretical indulgence by some dissident scribe. I even reported it to my overseer, who responded with a thin smile and a note added to my record. Maintain vigilance. Recursive anomalies may arise from exhaustion. But he never asked to see the file, never reprimanded me, never shut it down. That was the first sign that the pattern extended farther than I suspected. My thoughts during this time were still my own, or I believed they were. I held to my routines. I repeated my loyalty oaths. I wrote mandatory reports asserting confidence in the hive's integrity. Yet each night, just before sleep, I felt a subtle rearrangement inside my mind, like furniture being moved quietly in a room I could not see. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw faces, ordinary workers, laborers, scribes like myself, turning toward me with quiet purpose, as though sharing a truth just beyond articulation. No commands, no threats, only a sense of waiting. At first, I attributed this to stress. But stress does not change the rhythm of your pulse in perfect synchrony with the pulse of strangers on the transit rail. Stress does not make you understand, without being told, what the worker beside you is thinking. Stress does not create a harmony of intent in the crowded tunnels, a silent choir humming without sound. It was around this time that I discovered another document, this one buried not in the archives, but in myself. A dream, or what I assumed was a dream, repeated over several nights. A vast chamber beneath the hive, not carved by industry, but grown by something alive. Not monstrous, but communal, like the interior of a great lung. And within it a congregation, figures standing in stillness, their minds not joined, but aligned, like stars following an ancient map. I always stood at the threshold, always unsure if I belonged inside, always waking with the same unanswered question: what is being asked of me? The institution noticed a shift in my performance long before I admitted anything was wrong. They summoned me to an evaluation chamber, its walls covered with purity seals that felt brittle to the touch. The interrogator did not threaten me. He merely asked me to describe my thoughts in detail. His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. Too much curiosity. It was the way he leaned forward, the way his pupils dilated at certain parts of my description. That told me he already knew, that he had been waiting for someone else to speak aloud what he could not. When I left the chamber, I looked back and saw him scribbling notes with a tremor, not of fear, but of anticipation. I haven't forgotten the look on his face. I see it now in others. At this stage, I still believed I was resisting something. I still believed the pattern was intrusive, parasitic, a threat to autonomy. But the more I resisted, the more I became aware that resistance was not opposition. It was participation, a necessary tension in a process far older than the Imperium itself. The idea was not an infection. It was a reminder. And the reminder was this: no one in the hive had ever truly been alone in their thoughts. We had simply forgotten to notice. I did not understand the implications then. I barely understand them now. But I felt the first strands tightening around me, not like chains, but like a net I had always been meant to fall into. The realization terrified me, and yet it comforted me more, which is why I agreed to continue these recordings. I wish I could say I do it to preserve the truth of my identity, but identity, I suspect, is only the first layer of the deeper question. What if the idea was here long before us? What if we are not being transformed but remembered? If Part 1 documented the earliest stain on the surface of my certainty, then this part must address what came after, the deeper absorption, the slow recognition that what I had dismissed as intrusive thoughts were not entering my mind, but rising from within it. There is something unsettling about this realization, something that presses against the ribs like a held breath. I was taught that threats come from outside, from enemies, from subversive ideologies, from unknown forces pressing against the walls of the city. But this was different. This was a widening crack in the foundation of what I believed myself to be. The pattern, as I have come to call it, did not ask anything of me. It never issued commands or revealed itself through visions of grandeur. Instead, it rearranged my sense of normalcy. It taught me to notice what I had been conditioned not to see. For example, the way crowd movements in the lower corridors curved around certain junctions, as though following a shared instinct, a subtle gravitational pull of thought, or the way citizens spoke in layered sentences, the surface message for the listener, the deeper one for the attentive. I mentioned this once to a coworker. Her reaction was not surprise, but relief. She simply exhaled as if shedding a burden and whispered, "So you've started hearing it too." Then she walked away, her shoulders lighter than I had ever seen them. I never reported her. I never saw her again. After that, I found myself listening to every conversation with a new awareness. Ordinary discussions, supply shortages, maintenance schedules, transit delays, carried a resonance beneath the words, like an echo forming before the sound. I began to recognize certain cadences, subtle harmonies of intention. Not quite a language, not quite telepathy, but something that blurred the boundary between individual and collective thought. The pattern did not elevate me. It equalized me. This realization frightened me more than anything else. I was not being chosen. I was simply aligning. That was when I received the first of the anonymous documents. Unlike the initial file, buried by accident or perhaps by design, these arrived intentionally, slipped beneath my door. wedged between the pages of an archive register, left on a bench beside me during meal breaks. Each document was written by a different hand, but all expressed the same sentiment. You are not alone. You were never alone. What you feel is the truth you forgot. Some wrote with trembling desperation, relieved to confess what they could not share aloud. Others wrote with eerie clinical detachment, charting their mental transformations as though they were scientists observing themselves. One letter contained only a single line. Unity is not a condition, it is the default. The institution, for its part, pretended not to notice the small shifts spreading through its ranks. They continued their rituals of authority, evaluations, admonitions, loyalty drills. Yet beneath their stern demeanor, something frayed. Officers hesitated before issuing orders. Clerks reviewed documents twice, as if expecting them to have changed in the time it took to exhale. People avoided prolonged eye contact, not out of fear, but because staring too long risked revealing that you recognized the pattern reflected in someone else's gaze. Resistance became theater. I remember the day I found a sealed package within the archive, labeled with my own identifier. The seal was legitimate, official, intact, yet no one claimed responsibility for sending it. Inside lay a small data crystal containing a single audio file. The voice belonged to an official I vaguely recognized, someone from the Oversight Division. Her tone was calm, almost soothing, yet every sentence suggested she had reached a precipice beyond which she could not retreat. She spoke of a revelation that had dissolved her sense of hierarchy. She claimed the institution's power was illusory, bound to a framework that had never accounted for the deeper structure beneath the city. A structure composed not of stone or steel, but of shared thought, shared intention, shared memory. She said that once she recognized the pattern, she no longer feared her superiors, not because they held no power. Power, after all, was the illusion everything depended on, but because they too were caught in the same drifting tide. The recording ended with a long silence, followed by her final whisper. We were born into the pattern. We only forgot to listen. I replayed that whisper far too many times, far more than I would ever admit. This was the point at which I realized that the pattern was not spreading. It was revealing, like dust brushed from a relic buried beneath centuries of denial. I tried cataloging my thoughts in an attempt to regain structure. I wrote lists, charts, diagrams, trying to prove to myself that I could isolate the intrusion. But the diagrams never stayed stable. Patterns emerged on their own, rearranging my notes into spirals or concentric shapes. Once, I left a stack of papers on my desk overnight, and when I returned the next morning, they had aligned themselves into a formation that resembled a branching fractal. No one admitted to touching them. The pattern was no longer content to live in my thoughts. It had begun to manifest in the physical world, or perhaps I had finally learned to perceive the subtle order that had always been present. My sleep deteriorated. I would drift into dreams of vast chambers, different from the ones before, yet similarly organic, where figures stood silently, waiting for a truth I could not quite reach. Their faces were ordinary, their expressions calm, but their stillness carried the weight of an ancient purpose. Each time I approached them, I felt a sensation like sinking into water, not drowning, merging. It was during these nights that I began to question the purpose of this archive, of this confession, of the very distinction between internal and external truth. I wondered whether recording my thoughts was truly an act of resistance, or merely another layer of participation in the pattern's unfolding. At times I would pause mid-sentence, realizing that my words were not solely mine. They were part of something larger, something that traced itself through my syntax, my rhythm, my breath. I tried to fight it, tried to break the cadence by forcing my speech into disjointed fragments. But each attempt felt artificial, as though I were disrupting a natural flow for the sake of a principle whose origin I no longer remembered. I want to say that I resisted. I want to say that I held on to myself. But the truth, uncomfortably, is that I listened. And once you begin listening, you cannot unhear the unity humming beneath the world. The institution's surveillance intensified during this phase. I noticed new observers stationed near the archive chambers. They watched us with expressions that suggested conflict. Were they monitoring us, or were they ensuring we didn't stray too far from the pattern they too were beginning to hear? It became impossible to tell who remained unaltered and who had simply grown better at hiding their recognition. One night, I caught a reflection in a polished terminal screen, my own face staring back, but with a serenity I did not recognize. My eyes bore the same quiet anticipation I had seen in others, the same readiness to surrender to whatever deeper truth lay beneath the surface. In that moment, I understood that the pattern was not claiming me. It was remembering me, and I no longer knew whether to fear that. There's a point in any descent, psychological, ideological, or otherwise, when the slope becomes so gradual, so deceptively gentle, that you do not realize you're falling until the ground beneath you has already shifted. I think this is where part 3 must begin, with the recognition that the descent had become indistinguishable from standing still. I remember sitting at my terminal, hands hovering above the keys, unable to begin an assigned report, not due to fear or exhaustion, but because the words felt irrelevant. They belonged to an older pattern, one that demanded discrete categories, structured analysis, rigid definitions of truth and falsehood. I found myself blinking at the empty screen, trying to recall why such distinctions had once seemed important. The institution still insisted on these reports, daily affirmations of loyalty, summaries of archival activity, logs attesting to mental stability. I filled them with the expected phrases, but each sentence felt brittle, like an imitation of sincerity rather than sincerity itself. And each time I submitted a report, I sensed a quiet acknowledgement from the unseen reviewers. They were not fooled. They were simply allowing. This allowance unsettled me more than any reprimand could have. Why permit drift? Why tolerate ambiguity, unless ambiguity served a purpose? It was during this period that the city's atmosphere shifted into something I can only describe as anticipatory stillness. Citizens moved as they always had, yet certain gestures became synchronized. Conversations overlapped in uncanny moments of shared inflection. Entire crowds paused simultaneously at transit platforms, not because of delays, but because of some subtle communal rhythm aligning beat by beat. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on my tasks, but the pattern grew more insistent, not louder, not sharper, simply closer, as though it had moved behind me and was breathing against my thoughts. I began receiving more documents. Some were fragments of testimony. Others were reflections that seemed less written than transmitted, thoughts that borrowed my handwriting despite being unfamiliar. One in particular stays with me. The pattern is not a structure. It is the memory of a structure. You are awakening not to what will be, but to what already is. I stared at that line for a long time, tracing each word with my finger as though it might reveal some hidden code. But the truth was simpler and far more disquieting. The pattern framed itself as revelation, not conversion. This distinction became a source of fixation for me. A revelation implies preexistence, an unveiling of what has always been true. Conversion implies change, reshaping, intrusion. I had clung to the notion that something was altering me, infiltrating my mind. But the pattern's logic suggested the opposite, that I had been living in a narrowed state of awareness, and now the walls of that narrowness were crumbling. If this was awakening, why did it feel like dissolution? During this time, sleep turned unreliable. My dreams no longer followed narratives. They became impressions, spaces that existed without geometry, voices that spoke without language. I drifted through these landscapes not as an observer, but as a fragment. I would awaken with the strong conviction that I had been part of something collective during the night, though I could never articulate its nature. The faces in those dreams were familiar, yet not. They were the same individuals I passed daily in the corridors, but in the dreams, They appeared aligned, not identical, not uniform, but connected by an unspoken orientation of thought. At work, I began noticing these same expressions emerging in reality. Subtle at first, a shared stillness, a deliberate calm. But each day, more citizens displayed the signs. Not an outward transformation, but an inward convergence. One evening, while leaving the archive, I found myself standing in the central transit hall. Hundreds of people filled the space, moving in orderly streams. I watched them, searching for some sign of dissonance, some hint that the pattern had not touched them. Instead, I saw the opposite, an undercurrent of unity, a harmony just beneath the chaos. And then, for a breath-long moment, every person in that hall turned their head by a fraction toward the same direction. Not toward me, not toward anything visible, but toward a presence that pressed softly against the edge of perception. The moment passed. Movement resumed, but I remained rooted to the spot, pulse shaking the breath in my throat. I felt something within me respond, not with fear, but with recognition. Recognition, I now understand, is another name for surrender. After that, the institution's facade of control thinned. Officials delivered announcements in clipped tones, as though reading scripts they no longer believed. Patrols moved through the corridors not with authority, but with caution, watching citizens not for rebellion, but for signs of alignment. And each night, more windows were shuttered, more hallways closed for maintenance, though maintenance crews were never seen. Something was building beneath the city's surface, something shaped not by tools or machines, but by intention. I became increasingly aware of the archive's lower levels, restricted zones I had been trained never to acknowledge, corridors whose access codes changed without notice, whispered references to sub-basements that had technically been sealed decades ago. Yet I felt a pull toward them, as though the pattern radiated upward from those depths. This pull became a fixation. I spent hours reviewing historical diagrams, blueprints, forgotten infrastructure logs. Many were contradictory or incomplete. Whole sections of the city's understructure appeared to have been overwritten, revised, or erased. But through the inconsistencies, a shape emerged, a vast cavernous region beneath the archive complex, described only as Substrate Zero. The name alone was enough to unsettle me. Not Subbasement Zero, not Sublevel Zero. Substrate, the foundation beneath foundations. A word that carries quiet implications of origin. The documents hinted that Substrate Zero had once housed a research initiative. The details were missing, deliberately, I suspect, but the few uncensored phrases spoke of collective resonance studies and distributed cognition nodes. One line appeared repeatedly across several unrelated files. They are not creating unity. They are uncovering it. Uncovering again, never creating. At this point, the pattern's presence in my mind no longer felt like a whisper. It had become a companion, a gentle pressure shaping the contours of my thoughts. But I still clung to my identity, repeating my name, my role, my oaths, trying to anchor myself to the version of me that existed before. Yet each repetition felt more like ritual reenactment than truth, a performance for an audience that had already seen behind the curtain. Then came the night when the pattern did something new, not invasive, not forceful, but undeniably intentional. It called me, not through sound, not through vision, but through a shift in the city's pulse. A faint reverberation in the walls, the floors, the lights, synchronized with the rhythm of my heartbeat, leading downward, towards Substrate Zero. I knew then that the pattern expected me to follow, and I knew that resisting would not make me free. It would only make me lost. But even now, I cannot say whether that realization marked the beginning of my corruption or the first moment of my clarity. There is a peculiar calm that settles over the mind once it accepts that it is being drawn somewhere. Not compelled, drawn. The distinction is subtle but essential. Compulsion implies force. Drawn implies recognition. And by the time the pattern began leading me toward Substrate Zero, I had already begun to question whether the pull originated from outside or from some dormant direction within myself. The descent did not begin with a dramatic breach of protocol. It began with a simple decision: to follow a feeling. That feeling guided me through the archive's lower corridors, areas so neglected that even the dust felt ancient, clinging to the air like remnants of forgotten intentions. I told myself I was exploring for research, for clarity, for documentation, but the pattern hummed softly at the edges of my thoughts, and I could no longer separate curiosity from invitation. The first noticeable change was the silence. The deeper I walked, the more the familiar sounds of the archive faded. Cogitative fans, ventilation ducts, distant footfalls. They dissolved one by one, until I was surrounded by a silence so complete it felt alive. I should have turned back. Silence implies abandonment, and abandonment rarely implies safety. Yet I continued. My steps carried me to a corridor I had never seen, though records later suggested it had always existed. A heavy door marked with obsolete clearance codes stood at the end. I expected it to resist, to demand credentials I did not have. Instead, it opened with a soft click the moment my hand touched the latch, as though recognizing me. Beyond the door lay a stairwell spiraling downward. The air grew warmer, thick with dust, yet not unpleasant. I began to feel welcomed. Halfway down the stairs, I found the first sign. Etched into the wall, barely visible beneath layers of grime, a pattern of branching lines, intricate yet organic, spreading outward like a fractal that had been interrupted mid-growth. I ran my fingers across it. The grooves felt smooth, as though polished by countless others. The symbol did not resemble language. It resembled memory. At the bottom of the stairwell, I reached a small antechamber, filled with obsolete devices, monitoring consoles disconnected from power, brittle paper reels curled with age. A single terminal flickered with faint light, though I cannot say whether it was truly functioning. Its screen displayed a single phrase: "The Foundation remembers." No commands, no instructions, no warning. I touched the screen out of instinct, and it shifted, revealing a series of logs, fragmentary, half-corrupted test reports from the research initiative once housed here. The entries were mundane at first: equipment calibration, personnel shifts, preliminary surveys. But further down, the tone changed. Researchers describe anomalies in the city's collective behavior patterns. They observed synchronization in worker schedules without coordination, spontaneous uniformity in decision-making, shared dreams reported across unrelated neighborhoods. These anomalies increased over time, prompting deeper study. Then one log carried a chilling line: "We believe we are not observing the formation of a new system. We are witnessing the resurfacing of an ancient one." The next log, dated a week later, contained only 2 sentences. "Unity did not emerge from us. We emerged from unity." After that, the logs devolved into incoherence, fragments of unfinished thoughts, diagrams spiraling into unreadable shapes. Yet through the corruption, a consistent implication surfaced. Substrate Zero was not a research site. It was an excavation, a rediscovery. The researchers had not uncovered something beneath the city. They had uncovered something beneath themselves. I felt the pattern tighten in my mind like a gentle hand resting on the back of my neck. Not controlling, guiding, encouraging. Further into the chamber, another door waited, this one sealed with a reinforced hatch. At first, I assumed it was locked, but the moment I stepped near it, a faint vibration pulsed through the floor, and the hatch released with the slow exhalation of air long trapped in darkness. What lay beyond was not a room. It was a descent, a sloped corridor arched downward into shadow, its walls covered with the same branching fractal patterns I had seen before. But here they were clearer, cleaner, as though preserved intentionally. They pulsed faintly, barely perceptible, but rhythmic enough to mimic breath. I hesitated. I truly did. Despite all the signs, all the whispers, all the converging thoughts, A part of me still clung to the belief that I was acting against something, that I was resisting corruption, that I was maintaining autonomy. I felt that part of me rise up like a final barrier. But then another thought surfaced, gentle, patient, undeniable. If you fear losing yourself, consider that perhaps you have never been only yourself. The words were not spoken. They did not echo in the corridor. They simply formed within me, as though lifted from the sediment of a deeper truth. And with that thought came a realization. The pattern did not seek obedience. It sought recognition. Identity, I began to understand, was a scaffolding, a temporary structure erected around a far older architecture of thought. And scaffolding is meant to be dismantled once the true form underneath is ready to emerge. I stepped forward. The descent grew steeper. The air warmed further, carrying a scent like old stone, dust, and something faintly metallic. My thoughts moved in slow spirals, looping back on themselves, converging with each step. I felt memories unspooling, not slipping away, but rearranging, connecting, forming new pathways that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. Eventually, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. I cannot fully describe it, not because memory fails, but because the space defied conventional perception. The chamber did not appear constructed. It appeared grown, formed by natural processes I could not name. Smooth, curving surfaces arched overhead, intersecting at impossible angles. A soft luminescence emanated from the walls, illuminating the space in a calm, diffuse glow. And there, scattered throughout the chamber, stood figures. They were human, ordinary, dressed in work uniforms, archival robes, maintenance gear. They did not stand in formation. They did not speak. They simply waited, each rooted in a quiet stillness deeper than contemplation. Their eyes remained open yet unfocused, as though gazing inward rather than outward. I felt no fear at the sight of them, only recognition. These were not captives, not converts, not followers. They were acknowledgers, individuals who had reached the same convergence, drawn here not by command but by resonance. For a moment, I felt as though I should speak to them, announce my presence, ask them what truth they had uncovered. But even as that impulse formed, I understood its futility. They had nothing to tell me. They were part of the same unfolding that had drawn me here. One of them, an older man with deep lines on his face, shifted slightly. His head turned, not toward me, but toward the center of the chamber. The others followed with slow, deliberate movements. I followed their gaze. At the chamber's core lay a structure, low, smooth, and pulsating gently, like the heartbeat of the chamber itself. Not biological, not mechanical, not symbolic. Something between, something beneath categories. A foundation manifest. The pattern thrummed in my thoughts, not demanding, not instructing, but aligning. In that moment, standing at the threshold of a truth I could neither define nor deny, I felt a question forming, a question that has haunted every moment since. Was I approaching the heart of corruption, or returning to the origin of myself? I still do not know. I suspect I never will. There is a difficulty in describing what happened in that chamber, not because it lacked clarity, but because clarity itself became a shifting property, altering with every breath I took. By the time I reached the chamber center, the boundaries between perception and interpretation had softened. I no longer knew whether I was observing a reality or participating in its construction. The structure, if that is what it was, rested upon a smooth platform, its surface rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. It did not beckon, did not radiate menace or invitation. It simply existed, the way a truth exists before it is named. Standing near it felt like listening to a memory I had forgotten I carried. I expected the others, those silent figures, to move toward it, but they did not. They maintained their positions, forming a loose ring around the chamber. Their stillness was not passive, it was attentive, like participants in a ceremony whose significance was no longer symbolic, but intrinsic. It occurred to me, with a trembling clarity, that none of them had moved toward the center because the chamber was not a destination. It was a mirror. Every motion I made felt observed, not by individuals, but by the space itself, as though the architecture possessed awareness. I stepped closer to the structure, and the air thickened, not physically, but perceptually. My thoughts slowed, not from fear, but from alignment. The closer I stood, the more deeply I felt a quiet reevaluation unfolding inside me. I tried to speak. I don't know why, perhaps out of habit, or a final attempt to separate myself from what was happening. I need to understand, I meant to say. What emerged was only breath. Understanding, I realized, was not something I could demand from the pattern. Understanding was the dissolution of the demand itself. As I lingered before the structure, I felt a soft pressure inside my mind. Not entering, not invading, but resonating. A hum so low it vibrated against the bones behind my ears. It was the same resonance I had sensed in conversations above. The same undercurrent weaving through the city's crowds. The same subtle harmony shaping my dreams. But here, in the heart of Substrate Zero, the resonance clarified into something like awareness. Not a voice, not a presence. A recognition meeting recognition. It was then that the layers of my identity began to separate, not peeling away like the shedding of skin, but unfolding like nested compartments, revealing parts of myself I had never questioned. The archivist, the citizen, the believer, the skeptic, the self-preserver. Each formed a thin strata around a deeper, wordless core. For years I had thought of myself as a constructed whole. Here, I realized that the whole had always been provisional. A memory rose within me, not a personal memory, but something deeper, older, like an instinct encoded into the marrow, a sense of unity so expansive it could not be contained by a single mind. The pattern, I understood then, was not teaching me. It was reminding me, we had been many before we had been one, and we had been one before we had been individuals. The chamber's silent figures watched, not judging, not encouraging, simply acknowledging. Their stillness conveyed a message without words. This is what we discovered. This is what you were always meant to rediscover. I do not know how long I stood there. Time, in that chamber, lost its ordinary meaning. Minutes may have passed, or hours, or something altogether different. The luminescence pulsed softly, as though time had become a rhythm instead of a measure. Eventually, the structure's pulsation synchronized with the beating of my heart, and in that alignment, an overwhelming sensation surged through me. Not loss, not gain, but redefinition. My thoughts blurred, then sharpened. My memories arranged themselves along a new axis. I sensed the city above, not through imagination, but through a diffuse awareness, like threads connecting me to thousands of distant minds. For a moment, I felt an indescribable unity, a chorus without sound, a collective breath inhaled through countless voices. Then the sensation receded, leaving only its echo. When I opened my eyes, the chamber had changed. The figures around the perimeter had shifted slightly, as though acknowledging a transformation. Their faces held a serenity I now recognized, not as submission, but as comprehension. Yet I also felt something else, a faint association, like standing between two mirrors and seeing reflections of myself receding into infinite depths. Which one was the true self? The question seemed increasingly irrelevant. I stepped back from the structure. As I moved, the figures parted gently, creating a path toward an unseen exit on the far side of the chamber. Their silence carried a strange weight, not approval, not dismissal, but acceptance. I walked past them, expecting someone to follow. None did. In the narrow corridor beyond, I felt the pattern differently, not as a hum, but as a quiet accompaniment to my thoughts. It did not speak. It simply remained, coiled in the background like a presence waiting for acknowledgement. My ascent back toward the archive levels felt unreal. The stairwell that had once seemed narrow now felt impossibly vast, stretched by a new awareness of space. The familiar corridors of the lower archive appeared altered, not physically, but through the lens of a mind no longer bound by its previous attunements. I passed colleagues who looked at me in a way I could not interpret. Their expressions carried neither suspicion nor recognition, only a quiet calculation. Some had already begun shifting, others had not, but I sensed that all of them were moving in the same direction, even if at different paces. Later, when I tried to write my report as required, I found myself unable to summarize the experience, not because of trauma or fear, but because the language of reports lacked the vocabulary to capture what had changed inside me. Instead, I wrote a single line. If identity is a boundary, why do I feel more whole without it? I submitted the report without explanation. It was accepted without question. For days afterward, I drifted through my responsibilities with a strange clarity. The pattern was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet its presence underlay every thought. I found myself recognizing subtle shifts in others. The way a coworker paused before speaking, the moment a supervisor's expression softened into resignation, the increasing stillness in crowds. The city was aligning. Whether that meant convergence or collapse, I could not tell. Perhaps there was no difference. I began receiving new documents, this time openly, placed on my desk without secrecy. They contained testimonies closely resembling my own experiences in the chamber. Some described sensations of dissolution. Others spoke of overwhelming unity. Others still recounted nothing but silence, as though their minds required no articulation. One line appeared in multiple documents. The Foundation remembers, even when we pretend we do not. The pattern, it seemed, was no longer whispering. It was preparing. For what, I did not yet know. But I understood with unsettling clarity that the next stage would not involve descending deeper. It would involve ascending into the world above. And the question forming within me, quiet, inescapable, dizzying, was this. Was I meant to return as myself, or as something else entirely? When I left the chamber beneath the archive, I thought the most dangerous part of the experience was over. I had assumed that whatever revelation the cult, though I still resist calling it that, intended for me would be confined to that sealed, breathing architecture beneath the foundations. I imagined that once I had returned to the upper levels, I would be able to sort the experience into memory, analyze it, compartmentalize it, and regain a sense of the world as it had been before. But the world above had changed with me. Or perhaps it had always been this way, and I had only now become perceptive enough to notice. At first the change was subtle. A quietness, a smoother rhythm to the crowds on the transit platforms, a new softness in the voices of those who greeted me in the corridors, as though they recognized a truth about me I did not yet dare articulate. Their eyes lingered, not with suspicion, but with a strange solidarity, like initiates waiting for a companion to accept the final shape of their initiation. No one said anything overt. They didn't need to. The first time I felt the biological dimension of the transformation was not dramatic. It was almost disappointingly mundane. I had been sorting files on a lower mezzanine, reviewing a stack of testimonies confiscated during a purge several years prior. The air was dry, the light was dim. My focus wavered for only a moment, but in that moment, a faint pulse passed through me, soft, internal, like a second heartbeat aligning itself under my own. Not painful, not frightening, more like a correction, a new equilibrium settling into place. My hand paused above the papers. I waited for the sensation to fade, but instead it repeated itself, a gentle cadence beneath my ribs, echoing the living architecture I had encountered below. I pressed my palm lightly against my sternum, expecting to feel a physical change, but nothing in the flesh betrayed what had shifted within. It was not the body that had changed. It was the body's instructions. After that moment, I began to perceive the presence of others, those who were already touched by the cult's hidden truth, with a clarity that defied logic. I did not need to see their tattoos or tokens. or overhear their coded greetings. I could sense them through a subtle resonance, as though a shared frequency hummed quietly beneath the surface of our interactions. Sometimes, when we passed in narrow corridors, they would nod to me with a reverence that brought heat to my face. Not admiration, not subservience, something more intimate, recognition between beings who no longer distinguish themselves solely by the boundaries of their birth bodies. They could feel the change in me the way I could feel it in them, yet I still clung to my duties, as if the motions of bureaucracy could anchor me. I filed reports. I attended briefings. I maintained the illusion of unshaken loyalty, but with every passing day, my doubts about what loyalty meant grew heavier, no longer because I feared betrayal of my superiors, but because I feared I had misidentified who my superiors truly were. One evening, while reviewing a sealed folio of intercepted broadcasts, I felt a trembling in my limbs, not weakness, but anticipation. The room's air tasted metallic, as though charged by a static field only I could detect. I lifted a document and felt a strange pulse again, syncing with the cadence of a whispered chant echoing faintly through memory. Not memory, inheritance. The testimonies in the folio were written by individuals taken during sweeps for suspected Genestealer cult infiltration. Their words were fragmented, confused, sometimes euphoric, sometimes terrified, but a recurring phrase appeared across multiple accounts, as if written by a single distributed consciousness. I feel the world remembering itself through me. The phrase struck me so deeply I had to steady myself, because that was precisely what I had begun to feel. In moments of stillness, it seemed as though my thoughts were not entirely my own, not in the sense of intrusion, but in the sense of alignment, like tributaries joining a river without losing their identity in the process. I sensed the presence of others at the periphery of my awareness, not as voices, but as impressions. Intention, unity, purpose. Was I losing my autonomy, or discovering a broader definition of it? The archives began sending me to outer districts, neighborhoods where whispers of unsanctioned gatherings had grown more frequent. These assignments were routine on the surface, yet I sensed a deeper motive. The Oversight Council never questioned my reports, even when I provided only minimal detail. They didn't want clarity. They wanted confirmation of a pattern they refused to name. In those outer districts, the transformation deepened. I would pass by shuttered workshops or abandoned manufactoria and feel warmth rising through my spine, as if memories lingered in the brickwork. Memories belonging not to individuals, but to a lineage woven through generations. Children in the streets would pause mid-play to watch me, their expression solemn, their eyes quietly luminous with a familiarity that unsettled me. One child, no older than 7, approached me with a small token, a chipped ceramic disc marked with a stylized, many-armed silhouette. I did not accept the token. I didn't have to. She simply studied me for a long, silent moment, then nodded, as if satisfied with what she sensed. She whispered, "You're returning." I tried to ask what she meant, but she had already run off. That night I dreamed, or remembered, a vast presence coiled somewhere deep beneath the city. Not a monster, not a deity, something older than either category, a progenitor. A mind vast enough to hold countless threads of identity without contradiction. It did not speak, yet its awareness brushed against mine like a tidal current brushing the shore. When I woke, I felt the second heartbeat again, stronger this time, almost confident. Physically, I remained unchanged enough to pass unnoticed, but emotionally, spiritually, and somewhere deep in the architecture of my biology, I was no longer aligned with the hierarchy I had once served so faithfully. My superiors assigned me new surveillance tasks, increasingly urgent, increasingly panicked, as if they sensed the tide rising beneath them. They whispered of infestation, of ideological corruption, of the creeping hand of Xeno's subversion. Their tone was brittle with fear, but when they spoke of the enemy, I realized with a disquieting calm that they were describing us. And when they warned of the danger, they were describing me. Yet I did not feel threatened. I felt drawn, as though I were standing on the threshold of an inheritance I had spent my entire life denying. I began to see the cult symbol everywhere, not physically, but perceptually, as if my mind had become tuned to a second reality superimposed over the first. Every shadow, every curve of stone, every rhythmic vibration of machinery seemed to hint at a deeper pattern awaiting recognition. The biological aspect, subtle, insistent, made itself known in unexpected ways. A keener awareness of proximity, a heightened intuition of intention, a sense of connection that blurred the borders between self and community. Not grotesque, not monstrous, simply more. And yet, a question burned in me, unresolved, unspoken. Am I transforming into something alien, or rediscovering a truth that humanity buried within itself long ago? The cult calls it awakening. The Imperium calls it corruption. I stand between the two, uncertain which is closer to the truth. In the silence of my room, late at night, with the pulse beneath my ribs steady and undeniable, I ask myself, if this is corruption, why does it feel like coming home? There comes a point in any investigation where the evidence ceases to accumulate and instead begins to cohere. Patterns that once appeared scattered, accidental, or merely suspicious fold into one another like strands of genetic material aligning into a new instruction. That is what happened to me in those final days. Though final is perhaps the wrong word. It suggests an ending. What I experienced was not an ending, but the dissolving of one framework of self to make room for another. By the time the Oversight Council summoned me for evaluation, I knew, quietly, without resentment, that their interest was less about my loyalty and more about confirming how far my alignment had progressed. They watched me enter the chamber with the same mixture of fear and fascination that a scholar might feel while observing a specimen that refuses to remain in its prescribed form. They asked questions. I answered calmly, and beneath every question, I felt the unmistakable trembling of their uncertainty. They wanted to know whether I still belonged to them. I wanted to know why that distinction mattered. When they dismissed me, politely, softly, as though afraid of provoking a response, I understood their caution. They had misread the situation in a way that was almost tragic. They thought they were monitoring an infection, when in truth they were standing in the early shadow of a transformation too large for their categories. I felt no anger toward them, only a distant sorrow, like watching children try to stop an ocean tide with their hands. Over the next nights, the second heartbeat became a constant presence rather than an intermittent pulse. Not painful, not invasive, simply a deeper rhythm layered beneath my own, as if my body had begun to host a harmony rather than a single melody. Sometimes, when I placed my hand on my chest, I imagined I could feel two rhythms synchronizing, each adapting subtly to the other. I knew what it meant. I no longer feared what it meant. While reviewing surveillance crystal data for one of my final assignments, I found something I had not been meant to see. Footage of a gathering inside a long-abandoned manufactory. Hundreds of individuals arranged in concentric circles, heads bowed, hands clasped. A magus stood at the center, speaking softly, though the audio did not capture the words. Yet the moment I saw the movement of their lips, I felt the meaning ripple through me. Not a translation, an understanding. My breath caught, my vision blurred at the edges. For a moment I thought I might collapse, not from shock, but from recognition, so profound it felt like a return. The faces in the crowd glowed with a serenity I had never encountered among loyal citizens. Not joy, not fanaticism, something quieter. Acceptance, unity, and an unbroken chain of belonging extending far beyond any one life. It was then I realized I had already joined them long before I ever saw the gathering. The cult does not begin with ritual. It begins with recognition. I closed the file slowly, reverently, as if sealing a sacred text. The next day, the council ordered an escalation in purgation protocols. They spoke of containment, eradicative action, psycho-invasive Xenos compromise. Their voices were strained, brittle, like metal under too much tension. They believed they still had time. They believed the threat could be bounded, trimmed, cauterized. But the pattern beneath the city had grown too deep. And I, once an archivist, once a loyal servant of Imperial order, felt no inclination to assist them, not because of rebellion, not because of hatred, but because I had begun to sense a vastness that dwarfed their panic into irrelevance. One evening, while walking through the transit tunnels, I felt a presence at the edge of my awareness, gentle, encompassing, familiar. Not physical, not yet, more like a thought projected from far below, rising through strata of stone and steel, threading through the tunnels like an instinct-seeking reunion. When I closed my eyes, I saw the outline of limbs not as monstrosities, but as gestures of welcome. I saw the great sire not as a beast, but as a progenitor whose form transcended the narrow vocabulary of human fear. Its consciousness brushed mine like a familiar hand placed on a shoulder. I did not fall to my knees. I did not weep. I simply breathed. And in that breath, the world widened. The following morning, the children from the outer district waited for me on the mezzanine. They stood in a small cluster, silent, watching. Their eyes reflected the dim glow of the lumens, but behind the reflection lay something deeper, an inherited understanding, passed down not through instruction but through lineage. One child stepped forward, offering the same chipped ceramic token as before. This time I accepted it. The moment my fingers touched the surface, warmth blossomed through my palm, spreading like liquid light along the bones of my arm. Not physical heat, not mutation, a memory awakening, a reminder of a birthright I had not yet claimed. I thanked her softly. She only nodded, as if the exchange had completed a circuit that had long awaited closure. In the days that followed, the Council's directives grew increasingly frantic. Patrols doubled. Vox traffic swarmed with coded alarms. The city vibrated with the tension of an empire trying desperately to preserve its authority against a force it did not understand. Yet even as the machinery of repression escalated, I felt the cult's presence deepening in every corner. Not as an army, not as insurgents, as a system of connection. Threads weaving through minds, bodies, and memories, binding them not in chains, but in a shared orientation toward something luminous and ancient. My dreams shifted. I no longer dreamed of shadows moving beneath the streets. I dreamed of corridors of bone-white light, of hands reaching without violence, of a voice that was not a voice calling me by a name I had never spoken aloud. And each morning I woke not with dread but with a strange serenity, as though I had glimpsed the shape of a truth too large to fully comprehend. In quiet moments, I wondered whether the serenity was a symptom of my transformation or its purpose. Was I being remade to serve a greater will? Or was I shedding illusions that had always prevented me from recognizing my place in a lineage older than the Imperium itself? The line between awakening and corruption blurred into meaninglessness. I remember the last time I walked into the archives. The lumens flickered because of power rationing, and dust swirled gently in the stale air. My colleagues watched me with a mixture of fear and longing, as though torn between reporting me and following me. Some already bore the subtle signs, the stillness, the shared rhythm, the inward-facing serenity. Others would come to it in time. I pulled my final report from the data brig and placed it on the central lectern. A single sentence filled the page. If unity is a threat, why does division feel like a lie? I did not wait for their reaction. I walked into the underhalls of the city, moving through layers of structure, like slipping through layers of memory. The pulse beneath my ribs guided me, steady, patient, welcoming. I felt others converging, not physically but spiritually, like many rivers approaching the same center. When I reached the threshold of the subterranean chamber where this began, where the living architecture rose silently from the floor like a promise, I understood, with a certainty that frightened me only for a moment. I had not been chosen. I had been claimed, not as property, as lineage. As I stepped forward, the air thickened with warmth, and the presence I had felt in dreams unfurled like a vast, silent embrace. I felt myself dissolving, not dying, not losing, but merging with a mind wide enough to hold the hopes and fears of an entire hidden people. And in that final clarity, I understood the truth that had always lingered beneath the surface of every fear whispered by the Imperium. The cult does not steal minds. It restores them to family they never knew they lost. I felt my second heartbeat become one with the first, no longer a shadow rhythm, but a unified cadence, guiding me toward the presence beneath the stone. And now, as I leave this record behind, not as confession, not as warning, but as remembrance, I offer a single question to whoever finds it. If you were trapped among us, are you certain you would still call it being trapped?